Welcome back. In part two of this video series, I'll demystify why we read and concretize certain literary works in our anthologies and how we should approach which contemporary works we should remember for the long term. It would be great if literature immediately taught us its morals within, but it doesn't always work that way. Rather, it gives us a chance to experience moral dilemmas, and quality literature does not oversimplify the dilemmas of the world, unlike the glib, materialistic, quick solution vision of life offered in what we consume today on any screen we choose. We must read and reread from decade to decade, generation to generation, and era after era for the collective to digest complicated problems and tough choices that invites us to engage. In our current market, authors may write because they enjoy it. Maybe they do it because they're good at it and find the process fulfilling. Likely, many have a story to tell or a perspective to offer, or they want to turn their pain into art. Sometimes, yes, folks will write because it pays the bills, but there are relatively few who make a dime from putting their pen to paper or finger to key. While no single author writes for the same reason, once their work is out there, it's no longer theirs. It becomes ours. And we, in the end, get to decide what's worthy of forever based on quality and influence. As we progress in learning literary conventions and narrative dynamics, we find that the true meaning of literature lies in its power, as opposed to what makes it undervalued or popular, even though value and popularity are likely constituents as to why we remember it. Like our man Freddie, such a dynamic not only applies to literature, but music, history, film, fashion, and other fine arts. The power within, around, and beyond will be the ultimate test of who lives after they are long gone from this world. What this means for us is that we must break down what it means for a literary work to have everlasting power to remind us of what it means to be human and inform how we keep our humanity at the forefront of our lives. Sometimes that means we must re-examine a work's commercial or sensationalized status and privilege the ones that are sophisticated enough to endure the scrutiny and time that we will allot to its remembrance. I'm going to refrain from giving you a textbook definition of literature because my teacher heart is not married to a single comprehensive qualifier of literature, nor have I found one that includes great active verbs and adjectives that satisfy the memory collecting that we will be engaging in this semester. So when you think about literature, I would rather give you some qualifiers for this art form. And even if what we read is actually sophisticated, we shouldn't create a false dichotomy in our heads that literary is opposite of popular, because some very popular texts are going to end up being in the category of literary. My task now in the next several slides is to help you place and define as best as we can these incredibly relative and fluid terms, all of which should be a part of how we talk through and write about literature. A literary text is first timeless. We think, okay, 100 or possibly thousands of years from now, humans will be able to connect with a story or a poem because it illustrates human complexity in a novel way, one that hadn't been created quite like it before, and one that likely cannot be replicated without seeming like a fake. You want something new, innovative, and unique. The narrative, the form, the moral messaging, or the scope will transcend time and culture to a point that it achieves this sense of universality, even outside of its own historical context. The iconic image of Shakespeare's Hamlet holding the skull symbolizes each person's confrontation with death and human will, and it transcends time because in the end, we are all Hamlet. Some seemingly timeless works may not be as everlasting as we think over time. And if they are, then they are also contemporaneous. In a contemporaneous text, there is a sense of immediacy and intensity that these works offer to readers now. This may seem contradictory to our last to our last slide, but for a piece of literature to have power, it must do both, transcend its own time and remain immediate and relevant to our own timeline. For instance, we may be living in a cultural paradigm shift since the COVID-19 pandemic began. In the future, when we read literature from our current moment, we may look back and think, whoa, this piece of literature. On the other hand, we may not, because only time and experience will tell. So much of Stephen King's speculative and historical writing, for instance, has ended up being prophetic to future realities, especially all of the literature that he's written about viruses, conspiracies, and human psychology. They contain accurate futuristic hints as to the way society changes or the way we shift our focus from possibly the religious to the secular. And that's just one of the many relatable examples of how a piece of literature maintains its contemporaneity. Pictured here is a painting called The Death of Sappho from the year 1880. And we will read Sappho's lyric poetry during our time together, but it was published all the way back in ancient Greece. Even though Sappho is from the ancient world, she still spoke to folks in the year of our Lord 1880, especially for Selva, the painter, to position the legendary Sappho as the focal point of his painting. And she still speaks to us today. Her poems and fragments communicate so much about love of all kinds: romantic, unrequited, divine, and even brotherly. The translations of her work are so accessible for a contemporary audience too, which adds to the value of translation studies as a whole. A contemporaneous text is going to communicate a lot about our current problems, issues, existence, our hardships, what we celebrate, what we love. And of course, there is an argument to be made that all literature is about love in some form. So think about this whenever you're reading this literature over the next several weeks of the semester and how it's still palpable to us. Is it contemporaneous? Do the themes still feel immediate? Equally important for our class is how literary works are representative of their historical eras, even if they do transcend their spot in time. I personally could spend the entire semester in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but to properly survey the Western canon in a sophomore survey course like this is we only have so much time. So, literary scholars and educators like myself must make decisions about which works encompass how we can view culture, politics, art, communication, all in their own spots in time. Some literary works achieve this encompassing portrait better than others, and those will be the ones that we will likely remember because they've been passed down from generation to generation and further concretize their power and their influence. The metaphor that I like to use here for representative and how it is representative of its spot in time is the acorn. The acorn, of course, is going to become the oak tree. But then it's the acorn in one time, and then it's going to become the oak tree in ours. Just like how Ovid reimagined ancient Greek myths or for Roman culture in the Metamorphoses. And he did so to critique and ridicule tyranny at large, to highlight in microcosm some of the unequal sexual power struggles of ancient Roman culture. Connected to representation, What qualifies as literature will be historically formative, meaning that a certain piece of literature is inextricable from accurate portrayals of history. An example I like to use from our class is Homer's The Iliad, which was used forcibly as a piece of colonization by Alexander the Great of Macedonia when he conquered Europe. For my history buffs, we know Alexander the Great was a philosopher Aristotle's student. And once in power, Alexander conquered and colonized most of Europe with Greek culture, the technical term being Hellenization. He privileged the reading and teaching of Homer's The Iliad to forge the dominant colonizing culture onto the conquered to solidify his large empire. Not only that, if that's not enough, Alexander the Great also slept with a copy of the Iliad underneath his pillow as if he could absorb all of Achilles' glory through osmosis. And he prayed to Achilles' mother, the goddess Thetis, because Alexander identified so much with Achilles' character and his epic story. So, overall, it matters a piece of literature that we want to remember and canonize will matter in both history and in literary studies because we'll be able to recognize these layers and the power dynamics that unfold. Another adjective I really want us to remember when it comes to qualifying a written piece of literature as a classic is that it has attempted and succeeded at being transformative. A sophisticated poem, for instance, transforms the way we see a given subject, and as a result, the way we view our relationship to the poem's topic, images, message, and tone. We could witness an acorn fall from the ground and not think anything of it, right? As we're walking down a trail, it just is what it is. But then a poet could see it in a different way and communicate that in verse. And then we would go back on to the trail after having read a poem about an acorn, and we see that acorn and the entire experience anew. That's a pretty generalized subjective answer, but when it comes to the overall meta-narrative of literary history, there are so many more sophisticated ways that a piece of literature has to be transformative in order to be qualified as literature. Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince is a transformative text in the Western canon, no doubt. Among many in the genre called Mirrors of Princes during the early Renaissance period, Machiavelli educated the public on how monarchs maintained power, however just or unjust, over their subjects. Since then, the political sciences were born, and we've seen several texts include double talk, like Machiavelli's, to veil their ulterior motive in empowering those without any power. In sum, classic literature really should meet most, if not all, of these abstract criteria for it to be considered among the immortals. Also, these aren't just the great marks of literature, but art in general and can be applied in a number of other genres. Even so, if all these criteria are met, the most compelling candidates for immortalization, however, are these: appropriation and difference. Appropriation is an extension it's an extension of and a more formalized version of transformation. In a broader literary context, appropriation can also be a creative practice where writers consciously borrow, adapt, or transform existing text or ideas to create something new. This can be done for various purposes, such as homage, critique, parody, or even reinvention. When done thoughtfully and with respect, appropriation can lead to rich intertextual dialogues between works and cultures. On the left of your screen, you'll see a cropped section of Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. who is the Roman goddess of love, fertility, sex, beauty, and prosperity. And all of those great things, right? She's not just that, but she's the Roman counterpart to the Greek Aphrodite. Her origin story is unique in Greco-Roman tradition because she's not born in the most natural sense, folks. Her birth story is actually pretty gross. According to Hesiod, who was a kind of early mythologist, semi-contemporary of Homer, he wrote an epic poem called Theogony. And it was really the first attempt in ancient Greek history to chronicle the birth and creation of the gods. It's basically a genealogy of the Greek pantheon. Hesiod contends that the god Cronus castrates his own father, Uranus, and when Uranus's genitals were thrown into the sea, Venus was born in a complete adult form from the sea foam, which speaks to the inspiration of Botticelli's depiction of her in this painting on our screen. Not only that, Venus was known to absorb and alleviate male tempers, to turn folks' attention from sexual vice to virtue, because that is naturally what a good god is supposed to do, even though, sometimes they're not successful, but then sometimes they are. They may not have the best intentions either, but that also ties to her affiliation with military victory, although I also know Athena is a really big part of that as well. Some of the history and mythology that's been chronicled in the Iliad further characterizes these goddesses too. So, due to her association, her being Venus, her association with the military, it is really no coincidence that her son Aeneas, as depicted in Roman poet Virgil's The Aeneid, will flee Troy after the Trojans lose the Trojan War to the Greeks, and she will secure his victory to officially found Rome. So, in any case, the Venus trope, as I've just detailed it, it saturates popular culture. I hope that when you go back and watch some movie or television series or read a book, you can pick up on this trope. It's everywhere. It's usually a leading lady of male desire who is the ultimate prize. So that's all about the Venus trope, and anything that authors could pull from any of the details relating to her backstories and influence in classic literature is really meant to be some kind of foundation or formula for folks to define and redefine femininity. So on the right of your screen is a photograph of Christina Hendricks as Joan Holloway. Christina Hendricks is also an actress in Good Girls, if any of you all have seen that show. And the character Joan Holloway has often been called the subversive Venus. Without giving too much away about the series, Mad Men, within which Joan Holloway is a character, is set in the 1960s and focuses on an advertising company called Sterling Cooper on Madison Avenue. At the outset, Joan Holloway is the leader among all the office secretaries and deliberately but effortlessly stands out among her female peers. Venus was thought to be the most beautiful of all goddesses, and Joan in the show is no different. She exudes sex and power in the classically Venusian fashion, most Venusian sense, with a modern twist, of course. But she too will not have the same story as the other women in advertising, just as Venus did in her own birth story. She will calm corporate-minded and powerful men with her charm and sex appeal, and ultimately, after years of struggle and love, she lives a prosperous and intentional life. At the end of the admin age, women like Joan arguably win the war in advertising, And what the writers at Mad Men did was create the image and narrative of Venus in a way, a totally new way, recreated for the 21st century audience that transforms both how we perceive and relate to our mythological past, because we have an updated version of what Venus could look like in the 20th century and even into the 21st century for us. It also affects how we retrospectively interpret the big boom of American advertising and its role in shaping women, men, business, and our everyday lives. All this to say, the appropriation and subversion of the Venus narrative in Mad Men elevates the series' timelessness and innovation, which makes it a strong candidate for classic television. So I encourage you that as we work through our reading list this semester, locate how and why literary texts communicate with each other and appropriate the past to say something new about the present. This is not to say that an appropriated creative work like fan fiction or some popular novels will stand the test of time and be deemed literary by experts, but it is one of the many criteria that's most fascinating to me. This transformative quality will be important to how students understand the intertextual ways that literature communicates with each other, even in this class, and how new literary work is often conceived as a result. It's not as if new literature is created out of nothing. We likely cannot find, especially now, something that is purely original. It's a revision, an appropriation, a recreation, reimagination of something else. It's this originally Greek practice of inspiration, revision, reimagination, repackaging that continues to inspire us to tell these stories, but for new audiences. If a piece of the literature checks all of these boxes so far, then it is likely going to be one that's going to live beyond its organic height. What we've covered so far about what makes a literary piece of writing is already a broad set of guidelines that aim at objectivity, but still slope into subjectivity sometimes. That's what makes it art, I think. Even more personal, intimate, and individualistic is this criterion on our slide because it's even more relative. When we read Euripides' Medea, we will learn a bit about the genesis of the dramatic arts, in part through Aristotle's observations in philosophy, born from his work, The Poetics. It's one of my favorite pieces of ancient literature because I am, of course, an English nerd. And it is really helpful in understanding how our stories began to take shape in the Western world. So, in The Poetics, Aristotle is going to say, and he did say, poetry and drama at its best will imitate reality. We must remember that it is not the exact replication of the material world that artists should aim for. It's instead recognition and identification. So that is really up to our interpretation. Some of the delivery can be real, super realistic, mirror our own social realities, but for the abstract, the global, a successful piece of literature is one where we can recognize and identify even within difference. Imitating reality and being able to recognize it is the baseline. It's the crust of the pizza. I love food metaphors, so maybe bring a snack with you when you watch my videos or have it eaten beforehand. But recognition and identification are all the juicy toppings that you want to put on top of your pizza crust of just baseline recognitions. Aristotle suggests that what we see in literature is really ourselves. And sometimes we see ourselves in a way that we haven't seen ourselves before because of the positioning of certain characters and places that exude difference. However, some characters in literature will live on as cautionary tales or examples of what not to do. We absolutely need those too. Lots of the characters that we meet in this class, about those we will feel that way. I am absolutely not going to do what that character did because it is morally wrong or it is damaging to communities. I mean, you can think about all of the reasons why you would not want to be or reflect the characteristics of somebody in a literary text. So, hence, difference is really the truth that literature reveals to us. In the ancient Greek tradition, specifically with Aristotle and those come after him in the fields of poetry and drama, Greeks say that an audience member's collection of their emotional connection for a character over time will create this difference. Hence, we will experience catharsis or the expulsion of pity and fear. That's the best English translation that we have. Catharsis means the expulsion of pity and fear. We go to a party to have a cathartic experience to rid ourselves of all the stress of the week, right? So difference is the key ingredient to typify timeless, sophisticated literature, and it's subjective to you, and it's so hard to talk about because it's poetry in itself, because we both see ourselves and then everything that we are not or what we would like to be or something we haven't seen before. In comparison to popular narrative like mass market paperbacks or soap operas on television, where we know what's going to happen, all of that's familiar. But such popular narratives are pure imitations of reality, not so much recognition and identification. There will be a little bit of that in there, but what these popular narratives will do is perpetuate the repetition and similarity, which means, you could go to the Hallmark Channel and see really the same movie over and over again. The timeless, literary, sophisticated narratives or pieces of art are going to be the ones that can meld in that familiarity just enough to be a foundation to be exposed to the difference that's really the life-changing element of that piece of art. So as your professor, I won't reduce your study of literature to this pure identity imitation, because my self-ascribed value as to why I love being your professor already is to guide you to this recognition and identification, just as the evolution of literary merit and art will do the same over time. We must reflect on our own development. The more we expose ourselves to and actively seek out difference, the more we wrestle with characters and how we judge them, the more we can deconstruct our own assumptions about what connects us to each other, and then even complicates our relationships with others, hopefully for a better tomorrow. So we have arrived at the end of part 2 about what makes a written work a classic. Continue on to part 3 to put this information into the historical, cultural, and geographical context of the Western world. See you soon.